Most aggro decks can deal with threats without losing any momentum. But what if I told you there's one that actually gets stronger every time you cast an interaction spell, turning it into a permanent buff for your entire board? And yes, legends do matter. Ardbert, Warrior of Darkness. For just 3 mana in Orzhov colors, you get a 2/2 Spirit Warrior that turns every white and black spell you cast into +1/+1 counters for your entire board. Whenever you cast a white spell, all your legendary creatures will get a +1/+1 counter and vigilance until the end of turn. Whenever you cast a black spell, they will get an additional +1/+1 counter and they will gain menace until the end of turn. And the best part, these triggers do stack. So whenever you cast a multicolored spell that's both white and black, your creatures will get both bonuses for just casting one spell. 2 counters, vigilance and menace for your entire board. And that's the secret to why Ardbert is this dangerous. You don't have to jump through any hoops, you don't have to set up some weird combos, or you don't have to spend turns building up the game plan. You just have to play the deck, and by doing that, your board will snowball into an army of huge buffed up creatures that have both vigilance and menace. And this build is laser focused on that plan. We play a ton of really low cost efficient Orzhov legendary creatures that allow us to flood the board early. Ideally, in this deck we'll be playing a legendary creature on turn 1, on turn 2, and on turn 3 we can get Ardbert out. And from there, this deck will generate an insane amount of board presence and pressure. And because I prioritize spells that are both black and white, we will be getting a ton of Ardbert triggers, making the counter growth absolutely absurd. But here's what makes this aggro deck different from almost any other. Since we are in Orzhov colors, we do have access to the best removal and protection options ever printed in Magic. And because a huge amount of these spells are actually both black and white, every time we are dealing with a threat on the board or protecting our own board, we will also be buffing our creatures in the process. Every kill spell, exile effect or protection spell will also be functioning as a buff to all our legendary creatures. The result of this is a deck that's brutally straightforward, really consistent, and way stronger than it looks on first sight. You're simply playing cheap legends, dealing with threats on the board, and yet you are able to apply some consistent pressure from turn 1 until the game ends. As per usual, I will be going over every single card I decided to include in the deck and explaining why I decided to include it. This video is divided up in 5 categories: the legendary creatures, draw and support, interaction and protection, the lands, and a considering section. Let's get started by talking about the legendary creatures we play in this deck. These creatures are the backbone of the deck. 36 really cheap and efficient Orzhov legendary creatures that allow us to swarm the board early. All of these creatures have really potent effects of their own, and they serve as perfect conduits to actually stack counters on with Ardbert. Multicolored legendaries are especially valuable since whenever we cast them, they will trigger both of Ardbert's abilities. As mentioned in the intro, I did decide to run a really low mana curve, really allowing us to swarm the board early. You can also decide to turn this deck into a more mid-range variant, playing some more expensive legendary creatures, but in my opinion, Ardbert is a more aggressive commander and you really need to play a low curve to make him work. Skrelv, Defector Might, a 1 mana 1/1 legendary artifact creature with Toxic 1. Toxic 1 means whenever this creature would deal combat damage to a player, that player will also get 1 poison counter. The Toxic 1 ability really isn't all that relevant in this deck because there is no way you will actually be connecting with enough toxic creatures to get someone to the 10 poison counters. The main reason this card is in the deck is because it's a 1-drop legendary creature and it has a crazy activated ability. For 1 white for action mana and tapping Skrelv, we can choose a color. Then target creature gets protection of that color until the end of turn, it gains hexproof, and it also gains Toxic 1. This ability is just perfect to protect any of your valuable creatures from spot removal. If someone is trying to deal with Ardbert, for example, by casting a Swords to Plowshares targeting him, we can just pay 2 life, tap Skrelv, make Ardbert hexproof, and the removal spell will fizzle and Ardbert will survive. And even though all our creatures will already be really hard to block thanks to Ardbert giving our entire board menace, you can still use this ability to make a creature not be able to be blocked by creatures of a certain color. A really cool interaction with this card is whenever you cast a white spell with Ardbert and this on the field, this creature will actually gain vigilance. You can then just declare it as an attacker, it will stay untapped and you are still able to use its ability, making a creature unable to be blocked by creatures of a certain color, or just keeping the ability open to protect your creatures from any removal spell. Tiny Bones the Pickpocket, a 1 mana 1/1 one Death Touch legendary creature. And whenever Tiny Bones deals combat damage to a player, we are allowed to cast one non-land permanent from that player's graveyard, and we can spend mana as though it was any color. And honestly, this is a really good ability and really underestimated by a ton of players. Later in the game, if a ton of creatures are in graveyards by being in combat, being removed by a board wipe, spot removal, being milled, you can just use Tiny Bones to connect to players and you can actually start casting some of their best non-land permanents in their decks. Someone removed a Rhystic Study and it is in someone's graveyard. If you now connect with Tiny Bones, you get your own Rhystic Study. A Reanimator player milled their own Elesh Norn and we connect with Tiny Bones, we can now cast our own Elesh Norn. You're playing against a Junt self-mill deck and they milled their Big Italy, you can now just cast the Big Italy from yourself because you don't even need to generate red mana for this. You can just step your swamps and plains to actually cast this card. The options Tiny Bones will give you are absolutely endless. And remember, Tiny Bones does have the Death Touch keyword, meaning if you swing this at one of your opponents and you didn't even buff it up with 1/1 counters, they still have to make a decision. Or they don't block it and they give you a huge amount of value by allowing you to cast a permanent from their graveyard, or they do decide to block it and they will always lose their blocker in the process thanks to the Death Touch. Yoshimagu, ever faithful. This 1 mana legendary good boy is the best card you can actually play on turn 1. And that is because his ability is just absolutely crazy for any Legends Matter deck. And it's really simple. Whenever another legendary permanent enters a battlefield under your control, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on this little doggo. Obviously, with playing 36 legendary creatures in this deck, this ability is just absolutely ridiculous. But it doesn't even stop there because he doesn't say legendary creature, he actually says legendary permanent. This means whenever you play a legendary land, this good boy will still get a counter. And we do play a ton of legendary lands in this deck, be it a Takenuma, Baradur, a Minas Tirith. In my experience, whenever I got this creature out as early as turn 1, it was already at 4 counters before I even dropped Ardbert. Zak Fair, a 1 mana 0/1 creature that will enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. This in itself is already really solid. For 1 mana you get an overstated legendary creature you can start stacking counters onto with Ardbert. But his activated ability is absolutely bananas in this deck. By paying 1 generic mana and sacrificing this creature, we get to give a creature we control indestructible until the end of turn. And then we also get to move any counters Zak Fair had on it to that creature. And this ability just has a ton of applications in this deck. First and foremost, you can just use this as some sort of a protection spell if someone is about to wipe the board or cast a removal spell on one of your valuable creatures or your commander. And the best part is, later in the game, if you already had Ardbert out and you were able to stack a ton of counters on these creatures, the counters won't be lost. They will just be moved to the indestructible creature. So you won't actually lose any value in sacrificing him. Zak Fair really is one of the more versatile 1-drops we got in recent Magic sets. Amalia Benavides Aguirre. I really tried my best. I honestly have no idea on how to actually pronounce this name. A 2 mana 2/2 body with ward, pay 3 life, meaning if an opponent wants to target this creature, they have to pay 3 life to do so. And whenever we would gain life from any source, this creature explores. Whenever a creature explores, we have to reveal the top card of our library. If that card is a land card, we get to put it into our hand, essentially giving us some sort of card advantage by just drawing us extra cards. If it's anything other than a land, we get the option to put the card back on top of our library, or we are also allowed to put it into our graveyard. Pretty solid ability because it does allow you to filter your deck. If you see a creature on top you don't need at a given board state, you can just toss it into your graveyard. In this type of deck, we also do play a couple of reanimation effects, and you can then just reanimate the creature from your graveyard straight to the battlefield. Amalia also has an additional effect. Whenever we would gain life and the ability would trigger and Amalia is exactly at 20 power, we get to destroy all other creatures. Now, thanks to the counter-stacking ability of Ardbert, it's really easy to get Amalia to 20 power. By the time you are able to get her to 20 power, you will have access to enough mana to play like a protection spell, protecting your entire board and using Amalia as a one-sided board wipe. Just make sure you don't hit the 20 power if you have a huge board of creatures and no way to protect them. It's a nice little ability that does have some uses in some fringe situations, but that's not the reason why we play it. We mainly play it for the explore and the card advantage that it gives us. Brigone, Soldier of Meletis. This 2-drop creature has the heroic ability, meaning whenever we would cast a spell that targets this creature, we also get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. But the main reason why we play it is its activated ability. We can just tap this creature, remove a +1/+1 counter from it, and we get to draw a card. Since we are in Orzhov colors, card draw is actually one of the biggest weaknesses of this deck. It's really easy to swarm the board with cheap legendary creatures, but you will run out of cards in your hand at some point. And a simple 2-drop like this really solves that problem. A nice little thing you can do with this creature is just attack with it, and it won't get tapped because it has vigilance. You can then just keep it open as a blocker, and just before your turn starts, you can still tap it, remove a counter, and you will get to draw a card. Elas Ilkor, a 2-mana Orzhov legendary creature that's used in many aristocrat decks. And this card has 2 passive abilities. Whenever a creature would enter the battlefield under our control, we get to gain 1 life. In this deck, we do play some sort of a life gain subteam like you saw with Amalia, and this card will just give us a life gain trigger whenever we play a creature, which is something we will be doing every single turn. And whenever a creature we control would die, each opponent will lose 1 life. At some point, your opponents will have to deal with your creatures, and when they do, this will just be a slow drain for the entire table at once, really taking down their life totals. And as I mentioned when I was talking about Tiny Bones, Death Touch is a really good keyword in this deck. Because with Ardbert, you can just cast a white spell, this creature will get vigilance, so you can swing with it and it won't tap, and you are able to deal combat damage. And this creature will still be available as a Death Touch blocker, making combat really awkward for your opponents. Jirina, Dauntless General. Whenever this creature enters a battlefield, we get to exile target graveyard. Nowadays, in modern day Magic, a ton of decks rely on actually using their graveyard. Be it a Necrobloom landfall player that just wants to keep recurring lands from their graveyard, a classic reanimator deck that wants to reanimate big bodies like an Elesh Norn, or even a Spellslinger deck that wants to flashback spells from their graveyard. Playing graveyard hate in your decks is really mandatory, and it will win you games. On top of that, we can also sacrifice this creature to give all other humans we control indestructible and hexproof until the end of turn. Since we do play a total of 20 other human creatures in this deck, Jirina is just the perfect way to protect them, both from spot removal and from board wipes. Judge Magister Gabagant, a 2-mana legendary creature with menace. Sadly, the menace on this creature isn't all that useful because we will be giving it to him by using Ardbert anyways. And passively, whenever another creature or artifact we control would die, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. As you will see later in this section, we do play some cards that actually generate us clue tokens. Whenever we have this creature on the field and we sacrifice one of these clue tokens to draw as a card, this creature will get an additional +1/+1 counter. It's not the best card in the deck by any means, it's just a really solid 2-drop legendary creature that will give us 2 Ardbert triggers and will get some additional counters on the ones Ardbert already puts on it. Karlov of the Ghost Council, my favorite Orzhov commander of all time. And this is probably one of the only decks that actually plays Karlov in the 99 and not as an actual commander. A multicolored 2-drop legendary creature that will get 2 +1/+1 counters whenever we gain life from any source. Already a really solid creature body that will just keep growing itself with every single instance of life gain we have in this deck. But the best part about this card is its activated ability. For 2 mana and removing 6 counters from this creature, we get to exile target creature on the board, acting as one of the most efficient and repeatable removal engines ever printed. As mentioned before, we do have a ton of cards in this deck that actually gain us life and will stack a ton of counters on Karlov. But even when you don't have access to the cards that actually give you life gain triggers, we can still stack counters on Karlov by using Ardbert. And the combination of these two things is just insane. If you have both Ardbert and a life gain card on the field, the amount of counters you will be able to stack on Karlov will be absolutely ridiculous. And then for the low cost of just 2 mana, you will be able to remove any threat on the board. Karlov is just one of those cards that can lock down the game for your opponents. Lord Giscal Guado, a 2 mana legendary flying creature, and even though it's just a monocolored creature, its ability is just way too good not to include this card in this deck. At the beginning of each end step, if we put a counter on a creature this turn, we get to investigate, meaning we get to create a clue token. Obviously in this deck, thanks to Ardbert, whenever we cast any of our spells, we get to put counters on our creatures. And the best thing about this ability is that it says each turn. So even if you cast a Swords to Plowshares to remove a creature during an opponent's turn, you will still get to create a clue token. And as I mentioned, card draw is one of the biggest weaknesses in this deck, and the clue tokens really help you out on that front. Because later in the game, if you do have the mana available, but you don't have any cards left in your hand, you can just pay 2, sack a clue token, and you will be able to refill your hand. Loto, Corrupt Sheriff. Probably one of the strongest 2-drop Orzhov creatures ever printed. Whenever any player casts their second spell in a turn, we lose 1 life and we get to create a treasure token. In Orzhov colors, we basically have no access to any ramp, and Loto is just a crazy acceleration piece. If you can drop a Loto as early as turn 2, I can guarantee you by the time it's your turn on turn 3 again, you will have access to at least 1 or 2 extra treasure tokens. Because nowadays players will be casting multiple spells in every single one of their turns, even earlier in the game. They will be casting their mana rocks and then following up with any small creature. They will be casting a card draw spell and then follow up with a creature. They will be using their treasure tokens to cast multiple spells really early in the game. And obviously in the late game, everyone will be casting multiple spells in a turn. And this effect doesn't only trigger from your opponent's casting spells, it also triggers whenever you cast your second spell in a turn. And since we do play a really low mana curve in this deck with multiple really cheap legendary creatures and removal spells, we will usually be dropping 2 creatures or even dropping a creature and then following up with a removal spell. And then you can instantly use these treasure tokens because they don't even enter tap to instantly follow up and get even more tempo going. If you play any sort of Orzhov deck, no matter be it live gain or aristocrats, just a mid-range deck, Loto will always be a really good inclusion. There's really no reason not to play him. Papalima Totolimo. Yeah, I know some of the card names in the Final Fantasy set are absolutely ridiculous. Whenever we cast any non-creature spell, this card will deal 1 damage to each opponent and we get to gain 1 life, giving us a free life gain trigger for any of our life gain synergies and also whittling down the life totals of each one of our opponents. As you will see later in this video, we do play a really huge amount of non-creature spells, and all of these are really cheap spells and you will gain a ton of value out of a card like this. And on top of that, this creature also has a really cool activated ability. For 4 generic mana, tapping it and sacrificing it, each opponent that lost life this turn will have to sacrifice the creature with the greatest power they control. Thanks to this card's first passive ability, it's really easy to make each opponent lose life this turn. Then you can just activate this ability and each opponent will have to sacrifice their biggest creatures. This is a really oppressive effect, especially if you play in a pot that relies on just controlling 1 big creature. Shay Cormac. Whenever a creature our opponents control become the target of any of our spells or abilities, we get to put a bounty counter on that creature. And whenever a creature with a bounty counter on it would die, we get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on this creature. This ability basically means whenever we use a removal spell to remove one of our opponent's creatures, this creature will grow its body in the process. Because let's say, for example, we cast a murder on any of our opponent's creatures, we first target with the murder, the creature will get a bounty counter, the murder will resolve, the creature will die, and then Shay will trigger. Sadly, in this deck, most of our removal effects actually exile creatures instead of destroying him. Karlov, Swords to Plowshares, Anguish the Making, and since Shay's ability actually says the creature has to die and not leave the battlefield, we won't get any triggers of those bounty counters. That being said, we will still be able to grow this creature's body thanks to Ardbert's abilities. And the main reason why I include this card in the deck is actually its first activated ability. By just paying 1 generic mana, we can make all creatures our opponents control lose hexproof, indestructible, protection, and ward until the end of turn. This ability might seem really weird, but it will get you a ton of value. If someone is playing one of the Taros gods, you now have a way to actually deal with them. Someone has a Kerenko with lightning greaves on the battlefield and you really need to deal with it, you can just activate this ability, it will lose hexproof and you will be able to remove it. You play against a Cloud deck and they actually equipped Cloud with something that gives hexproof, indestructible, protection, or whatever, just activate Shay's ability and you now are able to deal with the problem. Spectacular Spider-Man. This is the first card from the Spider-Man set that I've actually ever included in any of my decks. For just 2 mana, you get a 3/2 legendary creature with flash and 2 2 awesome activated abilities. For just 1 generic mana, you can give this creature flying, making you able to fly over any blockers your opponents might have and do a ton of damage. And the reason why this card is included in the deck is because for 1 generic mana and sacrificing it, you can give all creatures you control indestructible and hexproof until the end of turn. The biggest weakness of any aggro deck is actually board wipes. Just imagine you're building up your board playing creatures on turn 1, 2, 3, 4, and then an opponent just casts a Supreme Verdict and you just lost all your tempo and you're basically out of the game. With Spider-Man, you can just keep 1 generic mana open, just sacrifice him whenever your opponents play a board wipe and your entire board will be saved. As you will see later in this video, we do play a ton of effects that actually prevent us from being blown out by board wipes, and Spider-Man is just one of those cards. Seer Von Them, a 2-drop legendary that already has vigilance and menace, which is absolutely useless because we will be giving it to him anyways by using Ardbert. Whenever another creature we control would die or would be put into exile, this creature will get a +1/+1 counter, and we also get to gain 1 life, turning this into a creature body that automatically will grow over the course of the game if any of our creatures are removed, and we will also be able to get some life gain triggers out of this, which then in turn will synergize really well with cards like Amalia or Karlov. And whenever this creature would die or is put in exile with its power being 4 or greater, we get to destroy target non-land permanent. Thanks to our counter stacking with this card's ability itself and Ardbert, this creature will always be at 4 or more power. If your opponents are then able to deal with this creature, it will take a non-land permanent with it. Tataru. Whenever this creature enters the battlefield, we get to draw a card, and an opponent also gets the option to draw a card. The fact that this card replaces itself by drawing as a card whenever it enters is just fantastic for this type of aggro deck, because you won't actually lose card advantage by playing this creature. And thanks to its second ability, actually giving an opponent a card is an upside and not a downside in this case. Whenever any opponent would draw a card when it's not their turn, we get to create a tapped treasure token. And this ability only triggers once per turn. This ability essentially means whenever this card enters the battlefield and an opponent does take the card, we get to draw a card and create a treasure token of this card, both giving us some sort of card advantage and also accelerating our mana. And for as long as this card is on the battlefield, if any opponent would draw a card outside of their own turn, we always get to create a tapped treasure token. This is just a really annoying creature body your opponents will have to deal with at some point, because otherwise you will just be gaining an immense amount of mana acceleration out of this. Ugnan, the Gomoka Warriors. Whenever this creature enters the battlefield, we are allowed to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Pretty cute ability, but it's all about the second ability on this card. Whenever we attack, target attacking creature with a +1/+1 counter on it will gain first strike until the end of turn. If that creature had 2 or more counters on it, it will gain double strike instead. As you can imagine, in this deck, all our creatures will always have a ton of counters, and just giving one of those creatures double strike will actually allow you to close out games really fast. Especially thanks to the menace our creatures will get whenever we cast a black spell with Ardbert on the field. This will make them hard to block and deal a ton of damage. Warnock, Rider's Chaplain. Whenever this creature would enter or leave the battlefield, each opponent gets the option to investigate. Each opponent who doesn't decide to investigate and create a clue token will lose 1 life. And then after each opponent made its choice to investigate, we get to investigate X times. X being the amount of opponents that did decide to investigate plus 1. Baseline, this card will give you at least 1 clue token whenever it enters or leaves the battlefield, which in itself is already really good. The other part of this ability that gives your opponents the choice to investigate is just a nice added benefit. Or you get to take down the life totals of the entire table at once, or you just get to gain some extra clue tokens. Arid Gainsborough, a 3 mana 2/2 legendary creature with lifelink. Whenever we gain life, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. And it also has an effect that's absolutely crazy for any Legends Matter deck. Whenever this creature would die, we get to put X +1/+1 counters on each legendary creature we control for each counter this creature had on it. Yeah, this ability is just absolutely ridiculous, and your opponents really can't win in this situation. Or they allow you to have a huge lifelink body that will just keep growing in counters and power on the battlefield, or they do decide to remove this creature and they will give an immense buff to your entire board. Because you don't just get to move the counters to one legendary creature, actually all your legendary creatures will get all the counters. Absolutely crazy card in this type of deck. Boromir, Warden of the Tower. Whenever an opponent would cast a spell with this creature on the battlefield, if no mana was spent to cast it, we get to counter that spell. This effect is really crazy and does have a ton of applications. You'd actually be amazed. Someone is playing an Apex Devastator and they actually get to cascade 4 times. Cascade actually says they have to cast the spell and don't pay any mana for it, so they won't ever get any cards into play by cascading as long as you have Boromir on the field, because all the spells will just be countered. You play versus a Reanimator deck and they want to cast a Dread Return by just sacrificing 3 creatures. No mana is then paid for that spell and they won't actually be able to reanimate something because the spell will just be countered. And this ability has a ton more applications that will actually help you out in a game of Magic. The list is just way too long to sum up in this video. That ability in itself would already be enough to include Boromir in the deck, but the main reason why I play it is its activated ability. On instant speed, we can just sacrifice Boromir to give all the creatures who we control indestructible until the end of the turn. Another perfect way to protect any of your key value creatures from any spot removal or board wipes. And if we use this ability and sacrifice Boromir, we also get 1 Ring Tempt. I will be talking about this later in the video. Brina the Demagogue, another really well-known and solid Orzhov commander. Whenever any player would attack one of your opponents that has more life than any of your other opponents, they get to draw a card. And we get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature we control. Now Brina is a really weird card, and let me just explain you how this ability actually works. Let's say your opponents are at 25, 20 and 15 life. You then have 3 creatures on the board plus Brina. You then decide to swing with all 3 of your creatures at all 3 of your opponents. First up, Brina will see your first creature attacking opponent 1, which is at the highest life total. So he can point at another opponent and say, I have more life than that player. This will then allow us to draw 1 card and put 2 +1/+1 counters on one of our creatures. Then we go to our second creature attacking opponent 2, which also can point to another opponent saying, hey, I have more life total than you. So we will get another Brina trigger, drawing us another count and giving us more counters. The third creature then is attacking opponent 3, who is at the lowest life total. That opponent doesn't actually have any other opponent of us to point to that has less life than he does. So our third attacking creature will not give us any Brina triggers. So just from our perspective, Brina already gives us an insane amount of value. If you just swing with 2 creatures at 2 of your specific opponents, you get 2 cards and 4 counters of it, which is just really insane value. But Brina's ability also applies for your opponents. Whenever they meet the criteria, they will also get to draw cards of their attacks, but we will get the counters on our creature. Brina is a really complex card with some weird interactions, but it is just a powerhouse of a card. It's one of the strongest Orzhov legendaries ever printed. And it for sure is a really cool commander deck that I will be doing a video about someday. Kambal, Consul of Allocation, a 3-drop creature with a really simple ability. Whenever any opponent casts a non-creature spell, they lose 2 life and we get to gain 2 life. Every deck will be casting non-creature spells at some point. Even if you're playing versus a dinosaur deck, they will be casting Mana Rocks, Farseek, other ram spells, and every time they do so, they will be losing life in the process and giving us a free life gain trigger, which is just excellent for us because we do play cards like Karlov, Amalia and Gainsborough. And Kambal can just outright win you games by itself if you play this against an artifact player that actually wants to chain a ton of cheap artifacts, or when you are playing against a spellslinger player that is about to storm off. Kambal, Profiteering Mayor, another 3-mana legendary version of Kambal. Whenever 1 or more tokens would enter the battlefield under our opponent's control, we get to create a copy of each one of those tokens, and this ability only triggers once per turn. If your opponents are creating a treasure token, we now also get to create a treasure token. An opponent is creating an 8/8 octopus creature token, we now also get to create an 8/8 octopus token. A Krenko player is creating 50 goblin tokens, we now also get to create 50 goblin tokens. Nowadays in modern day Magic, every deck will be creating tokens, be it treasure, food, clues, whatever. Thanks to Kambal, whenever our opponents do, we also get to gain a benefit out of it. And on top of that, whenever 1 or more tokens would enter the battlefield under our control, each opponent will lose 1 life and we will get to gain 1 life, giving us some triggers of life gain and also draining out the entire table. And as you've seen before in this video, we do actually play a ton of cards that actually generate us clue tokens, which is just fantastic whenever you have Kambal on the field. Cateramos, a 3 mana 4/4 lifelink menace indestructible body. The downside of this overstated body with really good keywords is that it can only attack or block whenever there are 7 or more cards in exile. And this doesn't only count the cards in our exile, it actually counts the cards in exile of the entire table. As you will see later in this video, in the interaction section, you will see we do play a ton of exile effects in this deck, and actually getting to 7 cards in exile is something that's really easy to do. So what I'm trying to say is Cateramos will always be active. There will always be more than 7 cards in exile. And whenever 1 or more cards are put into exile during our turn, we lose 1 life and we get to draw a card. Cateramos basically turns all our really efficient low-cost removal spells into cantrips. If you already thought that Swords to Plowshares is one of the most efficient spells ever printed, this card will now also draw you a card and replace itself if you have Cateramos on the field. The only thing you have to do is just make sure you play your removal during your own turn, because Cateramos won't give you any triggers if you cast removal during your opponent's turns. Lazael, Vlaakith's champion. If we would put 1 or more counters on any creature we control, we get to put that many counters on that creature +1. And this ability is just bananas with how the abilities of Ardbert are worded. Because let's say you have Ardbert and Lazael on the field and you cast a multicolored spell that's both black and white. You then will get 2 Ardbert triggers. The first trigger will put 1 counter on every legendary you control. Thanks to Lazael, they will now get 2 counters. Then the second ability of Ardbert will resolve and put another counter on each legendary you control, +1 thanks to Lazael. For as long as you have Lazael on the battlefield, every multicolored spell you cast will actually give 4 counters to each legendary creature you control. Yeah, I know, this will grow your board into really huge creatures really fast, and you will be able to close out the game. Lauren of the Third Path, a legendary creature body that allows us to deal with any artifact or enchantment on the board. And on top of that, we can also tap Lauren to make an opponent draw a card, and we also get to draw a card. And thanks to the vigilance, you can actually swing with Lauren first and then just tap her before it's your turn. Funny little synergy in this deck is actually combining Lauren with Tataru Tataru, because every time you tap Lauren and you give an opponent a card, you will also get to draw a card, and you will get to create a treasure token in addition to that. Lugus of the Dream Den, a 3 mana 3/2 lifelink creature. And passively, during each one of our turns, we are allowed to cast a permanent card with mana value 2 or less straight from our graveyard. As you've seen earlier in this section, a ton of our creatures actually cost 1 or 2 mana. For as long as we have Lugus on the field, we can actually recast one of those creatures once per turn, which is actually better than reanimating those creatures, because since we are casting them, we will get an Ardbert trigger out of them. Lugus is just a fantastic card that allows us to get some additional legendary creatures cast and get even more Ardbert triggers, giving us access to all the creatures in our graveyard. Rufus Shinra, a 3 mana legendary creature that actually will give us 2 legendary creature bodies. Whenever this creature attacks, we get to create a 2/2 legendary creature token named Darkstar, which counts as an additional legendary creature body we can actually start stacking counters on with Ardbert. The more legendary creature bodies we can get on the battlefield, the more efficient Ardbert actually becomes. Teza, Opulent Oligarch. This 3 mana dead touch creature allows us to investigate at the end of our turn for each opponent that lost life during our turn. As you can imagine, with some of the cards we play in this deck that actually drain the entire table, like Elas Ilkur, Papalimo Totolimo, and even Kambal, this effect will allow us to investigate 3 times at the beginning of our end step and actually create 3 clue tokens. This will help us out both with card draw and with Teza's last ability. Whenever a clue we control is put into our graveyard, we get to create a 1/1 spirit token with flying. This ability only triggers once per turn. You can use this in a smart way and just sacrifice a clue token in each opponent's turn, and per turn cycle, this will enable you to generate 4 1/1 flying tokens. Sadly, these aren't legendary, so you can't actually stack counters on them, but you can still use them to block any of your opponent's flying creatures, or to just get an extra small amount of damage in. Timna the Weaver, a 3 mana 2/2 lifelink body. At the beginning of our post-combat main phase, we get to pay X life, X being the amount of opponents that actually took combat damage this turn. And then we get to draw X cards. Now in this type of deck, you will always have the biggest creatures on the board, meaning you can easily swing one of your really big creatures at each one of your opponents. If your opponents then aren't able to block any of your creatures, which is pretty likely because Ardbert will be giving them menace, we will then be able to just convert a small amount of life into extra card advantage, which is just absolutely insane in this type of aggro deck. In my experience during playtesting, whenever I had Tymna on the field, her ability basically just read pay 3 life, draw 3 cards, which is an absolutely insane deal on top of an already really great multicolored lifelink body. Venat, Heart of Hidalin. Whenever we cast a legendary spell with this creature on the field, we get to draw a card. Sadly, this ability only triggers once per turn. That being said, it is still a really great source of card advantage because we will be playing at least one legendary spell every single turn. On top of that, it also has an activated ability for 7 generic mana and tapping it. We get to exile target non-land permanent and then transform this card. When it transforms, it turns into a 4/4 indestructible legendary god. And passively, at the beginning of combat on our turn, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control. That creature then becomes indestructible, and if that creature is legendary, we also get to draw a card. Now, while the backside of this card obviously has a really good effect, you barely ever will be seeing it, because there won't be that many games you actually will be getting to 7 mana, or in most cases there will just be better things to do with the 7 mana than actually transform this creature. Drana and Linvala, a 4 mana legendary creature with flying and one of the most oppressive effects in this entire deck. Activated abilities of creatures your opponents control can't be activated. You'd actually be surprised how many activated abilities are being used in a game of Magic. Your opponents won't be able to tap their mana dorks for mana. Your opponents can't sacrifice their Sakura Tribe Elder to go fetch a land. If someone is trying to go infinite with a Kiki-Jiki, it's just not possible anymore. And some specific commander decks are just absolutely shut down by this type of effect. And on top of that already really great and oppressive ability, we also get an additional effect. Drana and Linvala will have all activated abilities of all creatures our opponents control. And we can spend mana as though it was any color. If your opponent had a Purphoros, now we can use that Purphoros to actually start buffing up our creatures. If your opponent has a mana dork, we can now also use Drana and Linvala as a mana dork. And obviously there are way more options than this, but once again the list is way too long to just sum up in this video. Felisa, Fang of Silverquill, a 4 mana legendary creature with flying and the mentor mechanic. Mentor basically means whenever this creature attacks, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on another attacking creature that has lesser power than this one. Nice little benefit to just get some extra counters on your creatures and get some extra damage in. But the main reason why we play it is its last ability. Whenever a non-token creature we control would die, we get to create X 2/1 flying inkling tokens, X being the amount of counters that creature had on it. And as you can imagine, thanks to Ardbert, all our legendary creatures will always have a huge amount of counters. So if an opponent does manage to remove one of your creature bodies that actually had 10 +1/+1 counters on it, you now get to create 10 2/1 flying inkling tokens. And let's say you have a board filled with legendary creatures that are buffed up by the counters and an opponent is playing a board wipe, Felisa will actually see all those creatures dying. Let's say you have 4 creatures and all 4 of those creatures have 6 +1/+1 counters on them. You now will get to generate 24 2/1 flying tokens, which then in turn will require your opponents to cast another board wipe or they will just lose the game to those flying inklings. Felisa is an awesome creature that will protect you from both spot removal and board wipes. Ratatabrick of Urborg. This is probably the most iconic Orzhov Legends Matter card, and it is thanks to its awesome passive ability. Whenever another non-token legendary creature you control would die, we get to create a token copy out of it. That token copy will be a 2/2 zombie and it won't be legendary. Ratata really is a paradox in this deck, because on the one side, whenever an opponent does manage to remove any of our legendary creatures, we do get to create a 2/2 zombie copy token out of it, which will then retain all of that legendary creature's abilities. But the downside of this is that the token isn't actually legendary anymore, so we won't be able to stack counters on it with Ardbert. That being said, it's still a really good card in the deck for the same reasons as Felisa. Your opponents just can't win when they remove your creatures. When they spot remove or board wipe, you will just get your creatures back as 2/2 zombies. A really cool interaction with this card is whenever you have Ratata on the field and they actually manage manage to remove Ardbert, you will get a non-legendary copy of him. Then you can just play your real Ardbert in addition to that, and since the token is not legendary, you will have 2 Ardbert creatures. Whenever you then start casting spells, you will be able to stack an insane amount of counters on all your creatures. There is also one sort of infinite loop in the deck with Rattata and Boromir. When you sacrifice Boromir with Rattata on the field, you will get a zombie token copy out of Boromir. The Boromir ability resolves and everything will get indestructible and you will get a ring tempt. So you then will have to turn one of your creatures into your ring bearer. For this we will choose the Boromir token we just created with Rattata. Your ring bearer will always be a legendary creature, meaning you can then just sacrifice the Boromir token once again and you will just be able to repeat the loop. Because Rattata will just keep making legendary 2/2 zombie tokens of Boromir and they will be legendary thanks to the ring tempt. This will result into infinite death triggers and infinite enter the battlefield triggers, which then will just instantly win you the game if you do have a card like Elas Ilkor or Kambal on the field. You will just drain out the entire table. And the last legendary creature we play in this deck is Arvad the Cursed. For 5 mana you get a 3/3 lifelink death touch body. And passively he will give all other legendary creatures you control +2/+2. This is the card in the deck that has the highest mana cost and it's basically meant as some sort of an overrun effect. Just boosting the power and toughness of your legendary creatures over the top and allowing you to just close out the game. 5 mana might seem steep in this kind of deck, but we did need some sort of a curve topper. Before we continue, quick shout out to all the YouTube members that keep this channel alive and ensure that I can keep doing what I love to do. If you enjoy deep dive commander videos like this one, or you just like to hear me talk about cardboard for 1 hour straight, consider joining the YouTube membership program. You'll get early access to the deck lists of these type of decks before the videos even go live, access to some exclusive Discord chat rooms where I will be talking about the content I'm currently working on and giving you some sneak peeks, and at the highest tier you can even submit your deck for a personal review by me. So if that sounds fun, or you just want to help me keep my lights on while I keep brewing some of these awesome commander decks, hit the join button below the video or check the link in the description below. Next up we have the draw and support section. Card advantage is really critical in this type of aggro deck, so we do run a ton of efficient draw engines that ensure we can keep our hand filled and keep the pressure on. In this section you'll also find some utility and recursion cards that really help us smooth out our curve. Unearth, a 1 mana reanimation spell that allows us to return any creature with mana value 3 or less from our graveyard straight to the battlefield. As you've seen earlier in the video, almost all creatures in this deck cost 3 mana or less, and this card allows us to recur any of them for the low cost of 1 mana. In this deck we also play a couple of ways we can actually get creatures from our library to our graveyard, and then we can just use Unearth to get them back to the battlefield. If your opponents are actually able to remove Ardbert, instead of making him go to the command zone, you can actually make him go to your graveyard. Then you can just cast Unearth for 1 mana to get Ardbert back on the battlefield instead of paying the 3 mana plus any commander tax you would normally pay for him. And this card also has the cycling mechanic, meaning later in the game if you don't have a use for this card, you can just pay the 2 generic mana, discard it and draw a new card. Can't Stay Away, another 2 mana card that allows us to reanimate any creature with mana value 3 or less. If the reanimated creature would die, it does go to exile, it doesn't return to our graveyard. In this deck, this card is even better than Unearth, and that is because it is actually a multicolored spell and will give you 2 Ardbert triggers whenever you cast it. These cheap multicolored spells are really what make this deck work, because you will be reanimating a creature and you will be putting 2 +1/+1 counters on your entire board and giving it vigilance and menace. And on top of that, this card also has the flashback mechanic for 5 mana, meaning whenever this card is in our graveyard, we can actually recast it for 5 mana to just play it again, giving us another 2 Ardbert triggers and reanimating another creature. This is basically just one card that can give you a total of 4 Ardbert triggers and reanimate 2 creatures. Lunar Convocation. This 2 mana enchantment will check at the end of your turn if you gained life, and if you did, each opponent will lose 1 life. Another really simple drain effect triggered by our life gain triggers that will take down the life totals of our opponents. In addition to that, at the beginning of our end step, if we both lost life and gained life this turn, we get to create a 1/1 flying bat token. This ability might be quite tricky to pull off during your turns because you need a way to lose life and then a way to gain life. That being said, the ability isn't all that relevant because we can boost the power and toughness of these bat tokens anyways. And the main reason why this card is included in the deck is because we can pay 2 mana to life and we get to draw a card. This card basically functions as a repeatable clue token, because you can just pay 2 mana as many times as you'd like to just turn your mana into card advantage. The main reason why this card is included in the deck is because it's a 2 mana multicolored spell, and whenever we cast it, we will get those 2 Ardbert triggers we want. Ripples of Undeath, a really weird 2 mana enchantment that actually gives us some sort of card advantage while also filling our graveyard. At the beginning of our first main phase, we get to mill 3 cards. Then we get the option to pay 1 generic mana and 3 life and return one of those 3 cards from our graveyard to our hand, essentially allowing us every single one of our turns to dig 3 cards deep into our deck, pick one of those cards and then just draw it for the low cost of 1 generic mana and 3 life. So it both functions as an enchantment that sort of pseudo draws us cards, and it also allows us to put some creatures into our graveyard that we can then later reanimate by using Unearth or any of the other recursion tools in this deck. Black Market Connections, a 3 mana enchantment that allows us to trade life for some benefits. At the beginning of our first main phase, we get to choose one or more of these 3 fantastic options. We can pay 1 life to create a treasure token, accelerating our mana. We can pay 2 life to draw a card, generating us card advantage. And for 3 life, we get to create a 3/2 changeling token, giving us some extra board presence. That being said, the third option isn't as good in this deck because the creature token isn't legendary and we can buff it up. But you can still use it as a blocker or just as a small creature to get some additional damage in and close out the game. The best part about this card is that you can just choose all of the options combined. In my experience in this deck, this is just a 3 mana enchantment that says at the beginning of your first main phase, you get to lose 3 life, draw a card and create a treasure token, which is absolutely fantastic. Enduring Innocence, a 3 mana lifelink enchantment creature from the Duskmourn set. Whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters a battlefield under our control, we get to draw a card, and this ability only triggers once per turn. As you've seen, all our legendary creatures are really low cost and most of these have lower than 2 power. Enduring Innocence basically guarantees us that we can draw an extra card every single turn because we will be playing a low cost legendary creature every single turn, just keeping our hand filled throughout the course of the game. And like all the enduring cards of the Duskmourn set, whenever this creature would be destroyed, it actually returns to the battlefield as an enchantment, so your opponents will have to deal twice with this card. Welcoming Vampire, a creature with exactly the same ability as the previous card, Enduring Innocence. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control and it has 2 or less power, you get to draw a card. Same reasons as Enduring Innocence, just keeps our hand filled throughout the course of the game. Sadly, these 2 creatures aren't legendary and we won't be able to stack counters on them. Relic of Legends, the only mana rock we play in this deck. For 3 mana, you get an artifact you can tap to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Basically just functioning as a 3 mana rock that will accelerate your mana. But in addition to that, it has a really crazy ability that gets absolutely out of control in a Legends Matter deck. We can tap an untapped legendary creature we control to also add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. Now what this card essentially does is turn all our legendary creatures into some sort of mana dorks, which will allow you to then generate a ton of mana, empty your hand and just swarm the board with legendaries. But in this type of deck, Relic of Legends gets even better, because our best friend Ardbert will actually give vigilance to all our creatures whenever we cast a white spell, meaning you can just attack with your huge army of creatures and they will still be untapped. If you then have a Relic of Legends on the battlefield, this means you always will have mana open to play any instant speed removal, which is just absolutely crazy. I also want to mention that the reason why we don't play any other mana rocks in this deck is because our curve is this low and we don't actually gain that much benefit out of being able to generate a ton of mana. If we would play 2-drop mana rocks like Arcane Signet, Talisman, the Infinity Stone, a Signet, this will really slow down our board presence and we won't have as much pressure as we would in a deck without any of those mana rocks. We Write It Down, a 3 mana enchantment that will give all legendary creatures in our hand the Convoke mechanic, meaning whenever we cast any legendary creature, we can actually tap another creature we control to reduce the cost of that spell by 1 generic mana or 1 mana in that creature's colors. Whenever you have this card on the battlefield, you can basically sort of storm off with cheap legendary creatures. For example, you can just play 2 cheap legendary creatures, tap those creatures to convoke a 3rd legendary creature creature out, and it will really accelerate the pace at which you can swarm the board. On top of that, passively, whenever your commander attacks, you get to create a 1/1 red mercenary token you can tap to give any creature +1/0 until the end of turn. This ability isn't all that relevant in this deck. I suppose you get another creature body and you are able to use it as a chum blocker, but in most cases the 1/1 body won't matter. Yatan Tomb Guard, a 3-mana creature that's probably one of the craziest draw engines in this entire deck. Whenever a creature you control with any sort of counter on it would deal combat damage to a player, we get to lose 1 life and draw a card. And this effect doesn't say 1 or more creatures, you actually get to draw a card for each creature that connects with your opponents. And thanks to Ardbert, whenever you cast this, all your creatures will already gain at least 1/1/1 counter. Just build your board, swing with a ton of creatures, and usually you will be able to draw somewhere between 3 to 7 cards of this effect, which is just absolutely insane. If you can just keep refilling your hand by using cards like this, you can just keep dropping legendary creatures and swarming the board. Chocobo Knights, a 4-mana non-legendary creature I decided to include in the deck. And that is because its ability is absolutely insane and will close out games really fast. Whenever you attack with this creature on the field, all creatures you control with counters on them will gain double strike. Now usually in this deck how it works is you will control like 5 creatures that all have like 5 +1/+1 counters on them, making them into like 7/7 creatures. Then just drop this card, and instead of each creature dealing 7 damage, they will now deal 14 damage instead. If your opponents aren't able to block this huge double strike attack, they will be instantly taken out of the game. This card basically functions as some sort of an overrun card that just is made to close out the game whenever you drop it or you have it on the battlefield. And the last card in this section is the Kenrid's Royal Funeral, a 4-mana legendary enchantment. Whenever this enchantment enters the battlefield, we get to exile up to 2 legendary cards from our graveyard. We then get to draw X cards and lose X life, equal to the biggest mana cost of legendary creatures we exiled. And as I mentioned, we do play some self-mill effects to actually put legendary creatures in our graveyard, and then this enchantment is just fantastic. Even if you can just exile a 3-drop legendary creature and a 1-drop legendary creature, this card will still draw you 3 cards whenever you cast it. And on top of that, the cost of any legendary spell you cast while this is on the battlefield is reduced by 1 generic mana for each card exiled by this effect. In most cases, you will be exiling 2 legendary creatures with this, and all your future legendary spellcasts will be reduced by 2 generic mana. But honestly, since we mainly play cheap legendary spells, it's usually better to only exile 1 legendary creature from your graveyard. The cost reduction of 1 generic mana is more than enough for any creature in this deck. Next up, we have the interaction and protection section. One of the things that make this aggro deck really unique and stand out from the rest is how much high quality removal and protection we can play. We can deal with almost any threat at any given time, and Ardbert will still be growing our board thanks to his awesome abilities. Retribution of the Ancients, a 1-mana enchantment with an absolutely crazy activated ability for this type of counter-based deck. For 1 black mana on instant speed, we get to remove X +1/+1 counters from any creature we control, and target creature will then gain -X/-X until the end of turn, X being the amount of counters we just removed. This enchantment is basically a removal Gatling gun in this type of deck, because thanks to Ardbert, all of our legendary creatures will usually have somewhere between 4 to 10 +1/+1 counters on them. Thanks to this enchantment, for just 1 black mana, you can then convert those counters into spot removal. And since it is a -X/-X effect, this even goes through things like indestructible. This deck will always be ahead on the board. You will always have bigger creatures than your opponents do. But if your opponents are playing some value creatures like a Krenko or Kiki-Jiki setting up for a combo, you can just trade in the power and toughness of one of your creatures to actually remove the threat. You can't win the game if you lose the game. Swords to Plowshares. This 1-mana instant speed spell exiles any creature on the board, and the controller of that creature just gains a small amount of life. One of the most efficient removal spells ever printed. Change my mind. Down's Truce, a 2-mana instant speed spell that will give us and all creatures we control hexproof until the end of turn. A perfect card to protect your creatures from spot removal, and the fact that you as a player gain hexproof is actually really relevant. You'd actually be amazed how many cards in a game of Commander actually target players. For example, if someone is setting up for a combo with a Bresh Taunter dealing 1 million damage to it and they want to redirect it to you as a player, as long as you have hexproof, they can target you and you won't lose the game. In addition to that, this card also has the gift mechanic, meaning whenever we cast this card, we can also gift the card to an opponent, making them draw a card. When we do choose to gift the card, all our creatures will also gain indestructible in addition to this card's other effects. A perfect option to protect your entire board from board wipes. Despark. For 2 mana on instant speed, we get to exile any non-land permanent with mana value 4 or greater. And as you will see now, we are playing a ton of multicolored 2 mana removal spells that will give us 2 Ardbert triggers. So whenever you are dealing with a problem on the board, you will also be buffing all your legendary creatures with 2 +1/+1 counters, vigilance and menace. Dire Tactics. 2 mana, instant speed, we get to exile any creature on the board. If we don't control a human, we do lose life equal to that creature's toughness. As I mentioned before, we do play a total of 20 humans in this deck, so it is pretty likely you will be controlling a human whenever you cast this. And otherwise, life is a resource anyways, people. Use it. Final Payment. Another multicolored spell that destroys target creature on instant speed. As an additional cost, we have to pay 5 life or sacrifice a creature. Unless you control a useless creature token, you don't need like a red mercenary token, for example. You really don't want to be sacrificing any of your legendaries, so usually you will be paying 5 life for this. Orzhov Charm. One of the 2 mana Ravnica charm cards that allow you to choose one of 3 options whenever you cast it. The first option allows us to return a creature we control to our hand. A perfect way to protect Ardbert when someone is trying to remove him or playing a board wipe. You can just return him to our hand and you can keep him safe there. The second option allows us to destroy target creature on the battlefield and we will lose life equal to its toughness, just acting as a really efficient removal spell. And the third option allows us to reanimate any creature from our graveyard with mana value 1 or less. A perfect way to get one of your really annoying 1-drops back to the battlefield. Tiny Bones, Skrelv, Yoshimaru, Zakfair, and honestly none of the options on this card are broken, but what makes the Ravnica charms really good is the fact that you can just use the option that you need most at the given board state. I really love versatile cards. Rite of Oblivion, a 2 mana spell that allows us to exile any non-land permanent, but as an additional cost we do have to sacrifice a non-land permanent of our own. Like I mentioned before, we don't want to be sacrificing any of our legendary creatures, but you can use any of the treasure tokens or clue tokens you generate to actually sacrifice to use this effect. And on top of that, for 4 mana, it also has the ability to be flashed back. So 1 card that allows us to deal with 2 non-land permanents and will give us 4 Ardbert triggers in the process. Together Forever, a 2 mana enchantment with support 2, meaning whenever this enchantment enters the battlefield, we get to put 1 +1/+1 counter on up to 2 creatures we control. But the main reason why we play this card is its activated ability. For 1 generic mana, we get to choose a target creature with any sort of counter on it, and whenever it would die this turn, it gets returned to its owner's hand instead. Someone is trying to spot remove a value creature, just use this and instead of going to the graveyard, you will just get it back to your hand and you will be able to recast it. Someone is playing a board wipe, just pay a little bit of mana and you will get your creatures back in your hand. And thanks to Ardbert in this deck, you can make sure all your creatures will have +1/+1 counters on them at all times. Vanishing Verse, another really efficient 2 mana removal spell that allows us to exile any monocolored permanent on the battlefield. Anguished Unmaking, 3 mana, 3 life, we get to exile target non-land permanent. Flawless Maneuver, for 3 mana on instant speed, we get to give all creatures we control indestructible until the end of turn. And honestly, casting this for 3 mana is still a perfectly fine and playable card. But if we control our commander, we can actually cast this spell without paying its mana cost, making this into a free spell that can protect our entire board from board wipes or spot removal. And like I mentioned in all my videos, all the cards that cost 0 mana whenever you control your commander are absolutely busted and should be banned in the format. That being said, this card is just perfect for this deck because the entire purpose of this deck is controlling Ardbert at all times. Legion to Ashes, a 3 mana sorcery speed spell that allows us to exile any non-land permanent an opponent controls. And it will also exile all tokens that player controls with the same name as the exiled permanent. So for just 3 mana, you get a removal spell you can remove anything with. And if you are playing against a token deck like a Balin or a Chatterfang, for example, and they have like 10 million squirrel tokens, you can just deal with all of those for the low cost of 3. mana. Clever Concealment, a 4 mana spell with the Convoke mechanic, meaning we can actually tap creatures we control on our board to reduce the cost of this spell. And whenever we cast this, we can make any number of non-land permanents we control face out, meaning all those permanents won't exist until our next turn. So your opponents won't have any way to interact with your board until it's your turn again. And phasing out also has the benefit that it keeps track of the amount of counters that were on the phased out creature, and they will phase in with the same number of counters, so you don't even have to start rebuilding from 0 counters. Clever Concealment is already a really good card in most decks, but especially in this type of Ardbert deck, it gets even better. Because most turns you will be able to give your entire board vigilance thanks to Ardbert, so you can just swing with all your creatures and they will still be untapped. Meaning if you then have 4 creatures, you can basically cast Clever Concealment for free by just tapping those creatures and using the Convoke mechanic. So even whenever you're tapped out and your opponents play a board wipe, you still have an answer to that. And this is also one of the only cards that gets around the biggest weakness of this deck, being exile-based board wipes like Farewell or Merciless Eviction. Because most of our protection spells actually state that all our creatures get indestructible, a card like Farewell really doesn't care about this. It still exiles our entire board. But with a card like Clever Concealment, our creatures actually phase out, they don't exist, and you can dodge this board wipe. And in this deck we also play 2 one-sided board wipes. The first one being Damning Verdict. For 5 mana we get to destroy all creatures that have no counters on them. As you know by now, thanks to Ardbert, this will always be a one-sided board wipe. Because if you have Ardbert on the field and you actually cast this spell, your creatures will first get a +1/+1 counter, and then this effect will resolve. If your opponents are then not playing a counter-based deck, the board will just be wiped and you will be able to swing your huge creatures at your opponents. And they won't have any blockers left because their board just got wiped. And the last card in this section is Urza's Ruinous Blast, another one-sided board wipe. It's a legendary sorcery, meaning we can only cast it whenever we control a legendary permanent. And whenever we cast it, we get to exile all non-land permanents that aren't legendary. Now obviously this card looks really good in a Legends Matter deck like this one, but I'm actually thinking of cutting the card out of the deck, because at most times this card won't even act as a board wipe. It won't deal with your opponent's commanders, any other legendaries they control, and it does exile our own clue tokens, non-legendary enchantments we have on the battlefield. In some games I just straight up won the game when I cast this card, and some games it was stuck in my hand because I actually couldn't deal with any problems on the battlefield since they were legendary as well. Next up we have the lands, and even though we are a 2-color deck, we do play a ton of utility lands. Barad-dûr. This land will enter the battlefield tapped unless we control a legendary creature, which, as you can imagine, isn't a problem in this deck. Just taps for a black mana and has an additional little upside. For double X, a black mana, and tapping it, we get to amass Orc's X. Basically just a fun little land with no downsides to including it in the deck that can generate us some creature tokens, which you can then use as chum blockers or to get some extra damage in. Bojuka Bog. Whenever this land enters the battlefield, we get to exile target player's graveyard. And as I mentioned earlier, graveyard denial really is a must in modern day Magic. There's a ton of landfall decks that rely on using their graveyard, reanimator decks, spellslinger decks. Just play your graveyard, hate people. You'll actually win games of this. Cast Locthwain. For 3 mana and tapping it, we get to draw a card. Then we lose life equal to the amount of cards in our hand. This land is just fantastic, especially later in the game. If you just swarmed the board and dropped all your legendary creatures from your hand onto the battlefield, your hand will be empty. You can then just start investing mana into this land and you will be able to refill your hand really slowly. Usually, since we play some life gain effects in this deck, the life loss is actually irrelevant. Life is a resource anyways. Clive's Hideaway, a colorless land that has the Hideaway 4 mechanic, meaning whenever this enters the battlefield, we get to look at the top 4 cards of our library. Then we get to exile one of those cards face down and put the rest on the bottom of our library. Then whenever we control 4 or more legendary creatures, we can invest 2 mana into this, tap this land, and we get to cast the Hideaway card for free. Just a fun little land that doesn't even enter tap and allows us to cast some spells for free, because we will always be controlling a ton of legendary creatures and meeting the requirements for this land. Eganjo Castle, a land with a pretty cool little ability that might actually save some of your legendary creatures. For 1 white mana and tapping it, we get to prevent the next 2 damage that would be dealt to target legendary creature. If you play in a pot where someone is playing a red deck and playing things like Lightning Bolt or Pyroclasm as a board wipe, this simple land might actually save some of your value creatures. Eiganjo, Seat of the Empire. This is a land that taps for white mana and has the channel ability, meaning whenever this land is in our hand, we can pay 3 mana and discard it to activate its channel ability, allowing us to deal 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature, acting as some sort of a removal spell. And on top of that, the channel cost is reduced by 1 generic mana for each legendary creature we control. So usually you will be able to activate this channel ability for just paying the 1 white mana. Minas Tirith, the white counterpart of Barad-dûr. For 2 mana and tapping this land, we get to draw a card, but we can only activate this ability if we attacked with 2 or more creatures this turn. Since this is an aggro deck, we will always be swinging. And this is just a land that gives us additional card advantage when we do. Monumental Henge. For 4 mana and tapping this land, we get to look at the top 5 cards of our library. Then we get to reveal a historic card from amongst them, so a saga, a legendary or an artifact, and put it into our hand. The rest of those cards go to the bottom of our library. Another land that gives us some form of card advantage later in the game when we actually run out of cards in our hand. Plaza of Heroes. We can tap this land for 1 mana of any color, but we can only use it to cast a legendary spell, or it taps for any color amongst legendary permanents we control, but the main reason why we play it is its last ability, serving as some sort of an excellent protection spell for our value creatures. For 3 mana, tapping it and sacrificing it, we can give any of our creatures indestructible and hexproof until the end of turn. Shizo, that's Storehouse. For 1 black mana and tapping this land, we can give a legendary creature fear until the end of turn, meaning that creature can only be blocked by black creatures or artifact creatures. Later in the game, this simple land might actually win you the game by just making one of your huge creatures semi-unblockable and actually connecting to an opponent and taking them out of the game. Takenuma Abandoned Mire, the black channel land. For 4 mana and discarding this land, we get to mill 3 cards and then return any planeswalker or creature from our graveyard to our hand. And like all the channel lands, the cost of this ability is reduced by 1 generic mana for each legendary creature we control. If later in the game you actually lost or you milled one of your key creatures, you can just channel Takenuma to get it back to your hand and get a second use out of it. And the fact you can do this for only 1 black mana makes it absolutely fantastic. Vault of the Archangel, classic Orzhov utility land. For 4 mana and tapping this land, all creatures you control will gain Death Touch and Lifelink until the end of turn. As you know, building a board of really huge creatures is something that's really easy to do in this deck thanks to Ardbert, but if you are playing against a burn player or you are under a ton of pressure, actually giving them lifelink and swinging with them is absolutely insane. If you can swing with a total of 50 power on the board, actually give those creatures lifelink, you will be gaining 50 life. It doesn't even matter if your opponents decide to block these creatures or let them through, they will always be dealing damage and you will be gaining life. And this in turn will give you a ton of life gain triggers for cards like Amalia or Karlov. And we also play 3 of the MDFC lands in this deck, the first being Agadim's Awakening. For 3 black mana and X, you get to return any number of creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield that all have a different mana cost and the mana value has to be less than X. Usually you will be casting this for 6 mana to just reanimate a 3-drop legendary, a 2-drop legendary and a 1-drop legendary. Like I mentioned, 6 mana is a really steep mana cost to pay in this deck, but there are no downsides to actually including this card in the deck. Because if you don't want to cast a spell, you can just play the backside and it is a land that taps for black mana and even enters untapped if you pay the 3 life for it. Fel the Profane. For 4 mana on instant speed, you get to destroy target creature or planeswalker. It's really not that efficient of a removal spell, but like I mentioned, there is no downside to playing any of these MDFC lands. Since you can just play the backside, and like Agadim's Awakening, it's a land that taps for black mana and enters untapped when you pay the 3 life for it. Witch Enchanter, a 4 mana 2/2 creature that allows you to deal with any problematic artifact or enchantment on the battlefield, and once again, if you play the backside, it's a land that taps for white mana and you can even make it enter untapped. And for the regular mana producing lands, we play a Verge land, one of the dual face lands, Pain land, a command tower, a filter land, a shock land, a check land, a Horizon of Progress, a fetch land, a survey land, one of the Horizon lands, a bond land, and for basics we play 4 plains and 4 swamps. And last up we have the considering section. These are all cards I actually considered putting in the deck at some point, but at the last time I decided to cut them. Esper Sentinel, the 1 mana 1/1 white artifact creature that every Magic player knows. Whenever a player would cast their first non-creature spell in a turn, they have to pay X mana. X being Esper Sentinel's power. Otherwise, we would get to draw a card. Now, obviously, Esper Sentinel is a really strong card, but I do have a couple of reasons as to why it's excluded from the deck. First up, I'm really getting tired of including Esper Sentinel in any white deck I play. In my opinion, they should just bite the bullet and ban Esper Sentinel, because nowadays every deck that is in white is playing this card. Second of all, this creature isn't a legendary creature, so we can't actually grow it in power and toughness with Ardbert. I'd rather have a tiny bones dropped on turn 1 than actually playing an Esper Sentinel. This card can help you out with the card draw part of this deck, but that being said, I just don't really like including it in my decks anymore. The Ozolith, a 1 mana artifact that whenever a creature with counters on it we control would leave the battlefield, we get to put those counters on the Ozolith. Then at the beginning of combat on our turn, if this card has any counters on it, we can move it to one creature we control. In a counter-based deck, the Ozolith will always be a fantastic card, since whenever an opponent is able to deal with your huge buffed up creature, the counters will just be stored on it and you will be able to get some value out of them later. The Ozolith just feels like some sort of an insurance policy for whenever your creatures are removed, but we do play a ton of other options for that. And this card just doesn't push our aggressive game plan forward. It's another creature we can swing with and it doesn't grow our board. Killian, Ink Duelist, a 2 mana lifelink Orzhov legendary creature. Whenever Killian is on the battlefield, whenever we would cast a spell that targets a creature, it costs 2 generic mana less to cast. Now Killian obviously is a really great 2 mana legendary to include in any Orzhov deck that does play removal, because every removal spell you cast will have its cost reduced by 2 generic mana. As you saw in the interaction section of this video, most of our removal spells are actually costing 1 white and 1 black mana, and they have no generic mana cost. And I chose to go with those removal spells because they will actually give us 2 Ardbert triggers. We just don't play enough targeting spells with generic mana in their mana cost to justify running Killian. Tomik, a 2 mana 2/3 white legendary creature with flying. Now this creature is the absolute nightmare of any sort of landfall deck. With the recent release of Edge of Eternities, Junt Landfall and Gruul Landfall are really becoming a thing nowadays. So if you do play in a pot where there is a landfall player, just sneak in this little 2-drop and their entire deck will be shut down. They probably never even heard of this card before you played it against them. I decided to exclude it from the deck because I don't have any landfall players in my personal pot, and this card just isn't that good then. Nikaria, Lair Scavenger. Whenever this creature is on the battlefield and a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it would leave the battlefield, you get the option to draw a card and lose 1 life. In some situations, this card will give you an insane amount of card draw. But like I said, we really don't want our creatures to be dying, and we do play a ton of protection spells to prevent this from happening. Playing a card like this would just be counterproductive to the strategy we do in the main board of this deck, and that's why I decided to exclude it. King of the Oathbreakers, one of the most unique Orzhov legendary cards ever printed, and the perfect commander for a spirit tribal deck. Whenever this creature or another spirit we control becomes the target of a spell, it actually phases out. And yes, Ardbert is actually a spirit warrior. So for as long as you have King of the Oathbreakers on the battlefield, your opponents can't use spot removal on Ardbert anymore, because every time they target him, he will just phase out and phase back in at the beginning of our next upkeep. It's a really fun and unique card, and it does have some uses in some specific games. That being said, I'd rather run some really solid protection spells instead of running this wonky little legendary creature to actually protect Ardbert. And the last card in the considering section is Primeval's Glorious Rebirth. It's a massive 7 mana legendary sorcery we can only cast whenever we control a legendary permanent. But its effect is really insane, even though it comes at a massive cost of 7 mana. We get to return all legendary permanents from our graveyard to the battlefield. All our legendary enchantments, all our legendary creatures, all our legendary lands. Obviously, this is one of the best game finisher and recursion cards you can play in a Legends Matter deck. That being said, 7 mana is just way too high of a cost for this type of aggressive deck. If you haven't won the game by the time you have access to 7 mana, you're probably gonna lose the game anyways. And that's it for my in-depth deck tech on Ardbert, Warrior of Darkness. This is by far one of the most simple and consistent aggro commanders I've ever built. lot. Low curve, huge pressure, and the fact that you can keep growing your board while you are removing threats makes this deck an absolute nightmare to deal with. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, comment a ghost emoji so I know you watched the entire video. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.